Chapter 8. The Ambush at the Mountain Pass. The crimson sun had barely begun to crest the horizon when the horn sounded across Stanton. Right at dawn, Alex Valle roared, his voice carrying the electrical hum of the moss golden fight sticks fused deep within his chest. Behind him, the entire SoCal army surged forward in a deafening display of military might. They came mounted on high-velocity warhorses and cybernetic steeds, clad in armor forged from Arcade Shock titanium and Paradise Arcade composites. Their bodies radiated the golden thunder and hyper-perceptive vision granted by their sacred arcade relics. They were faster, stronger, and entirely unstoppable, or so they thought. As the vanguard of SoCal's rushing army thundered across the strategic mountain pass leading toward Northern California, the ground suddenly groaned beneath them. The trap sprung. NorCal's tactical division, moving in the shadows ahead of the front line, had laid a masterclass of psychological and physical warfare. Hidden beneath the dirt and gravel of the central highway were heavy-duty spatial disruption traps and kinetic sinkholes. As the front lines hit the center of the pass, the road collapsed into a massive trench. Steeds stumbled, wheels locked, and the entire army ground to a violent, chaotic halt. Before Valle could bark an order to reform, a deafening explosion echoed behind them. Boom! High explosive charges, rigged by NorCal's underground operatives, obliterated the massive stone bridge at the rear of the pass. Tons of granite and steel crashed down, sealing off any possibility of retreat. SoCal was boxed in, trapped in the center of a narrow gorge, with a blown-out bridge behind them and an ironclad enemy waiting ahead. The NorCal bombardment, perched high along the rocky cliffs overlooking the pass, the entirety of NorCal's defensive army, commanded by John Choi, Ricky Ortiz, Seth Killian, Shun, Bucktooth, Dave Zilla, G. Wolf, Inkblot, Scrub Killer, Campbell, Ohio, Cable Guy, Chunkster, Crystal, Easy, Senor Payaso, Lisa, Arleith, Corngo, and Coogie, waited with fingers on the triggers. Fire, Choi commanded. Instantly, the sky rained down absolute devastation. NorCal launched volleys of heavy artillery shells, energy beams, and localized missile strikes straight into the trapped SoCal formation. The impact shook the earth. But SoCal didn't panic. They didn't retreat. They didn't know how. Fueled by the hundredfold power of their moss relics, SoCal's generals and foot soldiers locked their shields together, absorbing the shockwaves of the explosions. With eyes flashing with lightning-fast combat calculus, they ignored the falling shells and did what they did best. They rushed down. Sprinting straight through the wall of incoming fire, using their hyperkinetic speed to dodge and weave past the blasts, the SoCal army charged directly up the steep cliffs toward NorCal's lines. High up on the ridge, the panic set in among NorCal's ranks. "They're not stopping," Cable Guy and Chunkster yelled, their eyes widening in horror as they fired frantic energy beams that bounced harmlessly off SoCal's golden shields. "Hold the line," Shun and Ohio screamed, planting their massive tower shields into the dirt. "Defend. Do not let them through." The general clash. The two armies collided like a freight train hitting a brick wall. The air filled with the deafening screech of grinding metal, shattered shields, and thunderous impacts. Within minutes, the artillery shells ran dry, the energy reserves depleted, and the guns clicked empty. Weapons shattered to pieces. Stripped of their gear, the battle dissolved into raw, brutal hand-to-hand combat. The pass became a chaotic war zone of exhausted, bleeding warriors trading blows in the dirt. Across the ridge, the elite generals locked into legendary individual duels. Clockwork and Ohio traded earth-shattering shockwaves, their bodies slamming into the stone walls with bone-crushing force. Duck-Dew and Scrub Killer clashed in a blinding blur of shadow traps and counterpunches, neither giving an inch. Mr. Power and Deathwish tore through NorCal's frontline enforcers, battling past Crystal, Easy, and Dave Zilla, ripping apart defensive barriers with raw plasma thunder. Valle versus Choi. At the very peak of the summit, high above the chaotic brawl, the two masterminds of the war finally met. Alex Valle stood tall, his moss golden core glowing fiercely through his chest, radiating arcs of pure electricity. John Choi stood opposite him, immovable as a mountain, his absolute guard forming a shimmering kinetic dome around his fists. Without a word, they moved. Their fists collided with the force of a meteor impact, sending a massive shockwave rippling across the entire mountain pass. They traded blows at superhuman speed. Valle pressing the relentless, lightning-fast offense of SoCal, Choi meeting every strike with an unyielding, unbreakable wall of defensive mastery. Punch after punch, kick after kick, the epic duel shook the foundations of the earth. The silence after the storm. Slowly, the noise of the battlefield began to fade. Around them, thousands of soldiers from both SoCal and NorCal collapsed into the mud, utterly exhausted. Weapons lay broken. Armor was smashed to dust. Fighters slumped against the rocks, barely breathing, bleeding, and entirely unconscious or too weak to lift a finger. Even the NorCal defenders on the ridge, including Ricky, Seth, Dave Zilla, and the rest, and the SoCal rushdown squads in the gorge dropped their arms, their bodies spent, barely conscious and staring blankly into the dirt. Complete, exhausted silence blanketed the pass. Only 2 men remained standing. In the center of the shattered summit, Alex Valle and John Choi were still locked in combat, their movements agonizingly slow, their breathing ragged and shallow. Every muscle in their bodies burned, their moss-infused power flickering like a dying candle. With one final, desperate exertion of will, Valle threw a thunderous right hook, and Choi met it with an iron-heavy counterpalm. Both hits landed. The 2 kings stumbled backward, dropping to their knees in the mud, barely conscious, gasping for air as the world spun around them, leaving the fate of the war hanging by a single, exhausted thread.